As required every 2 years by our Texas Constitution, today I'm delivering the 2024-25 Biennial Revenue Estimate, or BRE, for the 88th Legislature to use in writing the state budget. What a 2 years it has been. The disruption of the pandemic gave way to vigorous economic growth that kept our state in a national leadership role, helped drive record revenue collections, and provided an astonishing projected cash balance and left us poised to fill Texas' rainy day fund to the brim for the first time since that fund was created 34 years ago. Many positive forces have played a role in creating this growth, including our business-friendly policies, conservative budgeting practices, and ambitious Texans whose vision and hard work benefit our state. Some events, such as spikes in energy prices, are positive for parts of our economy and unwelcome to others. Unfortunately, our record revenues are partly due to the highest rate of general price inflation in 40 years. Besides causing revenues to substantially exceed our expectations, inflation also has driven up the cost of many goods and services. Increases recently have moderated, but many people and businesses still are bending under inflation's weight. Adding to our near-term challenges, we expect a mild recession. The expected downturn for Texas is relatively shallow and short, but it will not make Texans' lives easier. We cannot and will not lose sight of the fact that every tax dollar received by the state is coming out of Texans' pockets. As the 88th Legislature opens its regular session tomorrow, and as I devote the resources of my office to assist in lawmakers' decision-making, we know we have a responsibility to ensure every dime we spend is used wisely and prudently to the benefit of Texans now and in the future. The state will have an estimated $188 billion available for general purpose spending in the 2024-25 biennium, an astonishing 26.3% more than in the current 2-year budget period. These funds include $165.9 billion in general revenue related funds, or GRR. Tax revenues will make up about 89% of the total projected GRR, or $148.2 billion, while non-tax revenues will provide another $17.7 billion. These collections are augmented by an expected 2022-23 ending GRR balance of $32.7 billion. We must reserve $10.2 billion from the 2024-25 oil and natural gas tax collections for transfers to the Economic Stabilization Fund, or the ESF, known as the Rainy Day Fund, and the State Highway Fund. These reserves would be $4.5 billion higher but for the constitutional limit on the ESF balance, which we will begin to meet in 2025. In addition, a little more than $150 million must be set aside to support the state's original prepaid tuition plan, the Texas Tomorrow Fund. Its contracts are constitutionally guaranteed, so the state must make up any shortfall. Besides GRR funds, we are projected the state will receive $108.4 billion in federal money and $68 billion in other revenues. These funds are dedicated for specific purposes and therefore unavailable for general purpose spending. Taking all revenue sources into account, the state is expected to receive $342.3 billion in 2024-25. Focusing on tax revenues, we've almost come to expect records to be broken every month when we report collections, particularly when it comes to the state's sales tax, the workhorse of our tax system. Sales tax currently brings in 58% of the state's GRR tax collections, and its share is expected to rise to 59% in the 2024-25 biennium, when I project it will total $87.9 billion. The BRE forecast all fund sales tax revenue will grow by 7.1% in fiscal 2023, 2.5% in fiscal 2024, and 5.1% in fiscal 2025. These gains are particularly due to continuing price inflation, which will largely make up for slower consumer and business spending that may result from the projected mild recession. As you can see, inflation has played a large role in driving revenues over the last 18 months. We don't expect that to subside very quickly. The next largest source of general revenue in the coming biennium will be the oil production tax at nearly $13.3 billion. Followed by motor vehicle sales and rental taxes at $12.7 billion. The franchise tax will bring in a total $12.6 billion, but just $8.8 billion will be going to general revenue, and the rest will go to the Property Tax Relief Fund under the system set up when the current franchise tax was created. Natural gas production taxes will yield an estimated $8.6 billion. I would caution that severance taxes are notably volatile. I expect that volatility to continue as energy markets continue to grapple with supply chain issues, global geopolitical uncertainty, and policies that have discouraged investment in domestic energy exploration and production. This constant volatility is one reason lawmakers used a portion of this revenue to create the rainy day fund, lessening the reliance on this money to support day-to-day expenses. The Rainy Day Fund was created through a constitutional amendment approved by Texas voters in 1988 after a drop in oil prices and a recession had forced a tax increase. As our state savings account, the fund can be tapped with a supermajority vote of the legislature, whether to help in economic downturns or for other purposes. In addition to severance tax transfers, one half of any unencumbered and unobligated general revenue balances remaining in GR at the end of the biennium must be transferred to the Rainy Day Fund. That does not happen very often, but we are projecting a substantial unencumbered balance at the end of the 2022-23 biennium, resulting in a $5.71 billion transfer due to the Rainy Day Fund early in fiscal 2024. As a result of the unencumbered balance transfer and strong severance tax collections, I'm projecting for the first time that planned transfers to the Rainy Day Fund in fiscal 2025 would push it to the maximum balance, which in each biennium can be no more than 10% of the amount of general revenue deposited during the previous biennium. The fund's cap will be an estimated $26.4 billion in the 2024-25 biennium, but regular planned transfers would push the balance to reach nearly $28 billion in fiscal 2025. Planned transfers for fiscal 2026 also would result in the Rainy Day Fund's balance exceeding its limit for that year. That means that about $4.5 billion of severance tax money that would otherwise be set aside for transfers to the Rainy Day Fund instead will remain in general revenue. I must note that if lawmakers take action that eliminate or greatly reduce the amount of unencumbered GR to be transferred to the Rainy Day Fund in fiscal 2024, the ESF may not reach its cap in fiscal 2025. The BRE is not the only thing that determines the amount that lawmakers can or will actually spend. Our state constitution sets limits on spending, including a limit in Article 8, Section 22, that applies to state tax revenues that aren't constitutionally dedicated. The amount appropriated from these funds can't exceed the rate of growth of the state economy unless a majority of the legislature approves. In addition, the 87th legislature limited growth in appropriations of consolidated general revenue to the rate of growth in combined population and inflation, except for tax relief or disaster recovery. Consolidated general revenue appropriations include spending from the General Revenue Fund, General Revenue Dedicated Funds, and general revenue related funds. Exceeding the limit on these funds would require a 3/5 vote of the legislature, saying an emergency requires it. For the 2024-25 biennium, the LBB adopted 12.33% as the growth rate limit for both the long-standing cap on appropriations of revenue not dedicated by the Constitution and the new limit on the growth in consolidated GR appropriations that becomes effective for the 2024-25 biennium. Even with constitutional spending limits and an inflation-influenced new normal, the enormous amount of projected revenue gives the state a remarkable or a truly once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for historical actions this legislative session. As a former lawmaker myself, I know very well that the legislature decides how to use all of the money they have available. Yet I must advise some caution as these decisions are made. Bluntly, don't count on me announcing another big revenue jump in 2 years from now. The revenue increases that we've seen have been in many ways unprecedented, and we cannot reasonably expect a repeat. We are unlikely to have an opportunity like this again. As I said, this budgeting session is truly a once-in-a-lifetime session. As always, the state must be careful in its spending to ensure we don't face ongoing costs when this surplus is a memory. Thoughtful options might include investment in our electrical grid, broadband connectivity, port and water infrastructure, salary adjustments for state employees, our teachers, and nurses, and the development of our skilled trade workforce. Texas must continue to fill the substantial void left by the federal government along our Texas border as people from all over the world continue to pour into our border communities. The federal government's failure is putting tremendous strain on Texas' infrastructure and law enforcement personnel, infringing on the rights of private landowners and depleting state and local resources. And lawmakers should consider meaningful tax reductions to ease the burden of Texans who are grappling with inflation, economic uncertainty, and rising housing costs. Well thought out spending proposals can have positive results without creating demands on general revenue that might be difficult to meet in years to come. As you can see, the projected ending balance that legislators will have at their disposal shatters previous record surpluses. But the amount available for general purpose spending in 2024-25 could be substantially higher if the legislature chooses to substitute some available federal funds for general revenue, as lawmakers did in 2022-23 budget. The BRE already reflects $3.8 billion in general revenue savings carried forward from 2021 due to the use of pandemic-related federal funds. This revenue forecast is more positive than anyone had reason to expect, especially given the vast uncertainty that came with the pandemic, the impacts of Winter Storm Uri, ongoing supply chain disruptions, shifting COVID policies in China, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I must warn leaders and lawmakers that this BRE also is subject to substantial uncertainty. High inflation remains very real. It is above the Fed's policy target, and additional interest rate increases appear likely to try to control it. If inflation doesn't slow down significantly, the Fed's action to check it may prompt a much deeper recession than we currently anticipate. Consumer spending will slow as employment drops and as people deplete any savings accumulated during the pandemic. Activity that is sensitive to interest rates, such as construction, will decline from the current levels as the Federal Reserve continues with a tight monetary policy. Beyond our country's borders, global recession could decrease the demand for oil, driving it below the break-even point for many Texas producers. On the other hand, oil prices could surge again, assuming there is more demand as China drops its COVID restrictions and returns to more rapid economic growth, especially with Russian production faltering in the face of sanctions over the Ukraine invasion. This second scenario would be a boon for Texas energy producers, but hurt other business sectors and cause even more inflation. Our economic environment, as ever, is filled with challenges as well as possibilities. I am certain that Texas is more than ready to handle both, but we must be aware of the potential for change and act prudently. I am ready to continue working with lawmakers as they make crucial budgeting decisions, and so are the dedicated, skilled professionals in my office. As always, I pledge to keep leaders, lawmakers, and the public apprised of changing conditions, and I will be quick to update this revenue estimate if warranted. I would be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you, Controller Hager, and thank you to all of our attendees today. My name is Chris Bryan. I'm the Director of Communications and Information Services at the Controller's Office. I appreciate you're all bearing with us. We had a few little minor technical things there, a little bit of latency in the video, but it sounds like the sound went through all right for everybody. Those of you who are attending today should feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature of the MS Teams Live platform. If the Q&A feature is not already up on your screen right now, you can find that by clicking on the icon of the two small dialog boxes with the question marks in them, and that should be in the upper right portion of your screen. If you're watching on your phone, you might have to tap your screen to get those to pop up. But again, those are the dialog boxes with the little question marks in there, and that should open up the Q&A portion. A note for our audience members, you're welcome to ask questions anonymously. We do ask as a courtesy from members of the press and legislative staff. If you could enter your name and affiliation in the Your Name field, and then just enter your question in the Ask a Question field. That helps me and our moderators to make sure we get to as many of those questions as possible as time permits. Again, feel free to submit questions anonymously, but if you are a member of the press or a legislative staffer, it is helpful for us if you enter your name and affiliation. Controller, thank you for the wealth of information that you delivered here today. I know there are a lot of folks in attendance who, like me, heard a lot of numbers, a lot of different information, and are hoping that you might be able to help us kind of make sense of what we heard and really kind of summarize and explain to us where we are, how we got here, where we're going.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Chris, for that. And thank you for everybody that's listening and watching, and we'll be happy to answer your questions today. And if you have follow-up questions, make sure to get back with us. We're happy to work through the details. There's a lot of complicated moving pieces to a revenue estimate. This one more so than any one that we have ever dealt with before. A lot of different things, a lot of different moving pieces. But really, to sum up everything that we talked about today is that the legislature starts in tomorrow. They're in session for 140 days, and the one and only thing that they have to do is pass a 2-year budget. And with the revenues that I'm announcing today, as we see the economy as it stands in Texas today for the next 2 years, that this truly is what I deem a once-in-a-lifetime legislative session for budgeting and priorities that the legislature may want to fund. And if you look at how we got here today, really in part, one, very robust economy in the state of Texas, robust sales tax collections, in part consumers, you and I, as well as businesses, the activities that we've had in the last 18 months and 12 months in particularly. And for those of you that may not recall from the numbers we said earlier, sales tax is roughly almost 60% of all the sales of all the tax collections that we have. So while all revenue streams are important, that is the major piece that drives the health of the state budget. And also, we've had very robust severance tax collections in both oil and natural gas, those two components. And then unfortunately, you and I, individuals, businesses, are paying more for items than we were last year, 18 months, and 2 years ago with a 40-year high inflation. And to make a point, in the last month, the last several months, you and I as individuals, businesses on taxable sales tax items are roughly paying about $4.5 billion more a month for these same taxable items than we were just a year ago. And so that doesn't include groceries, that doesn't include medication, because those are not subject to sales tax. And that's even more dollars that we're spending. But roughly that's about $45 billion that consumers have paid more in the last 12 months than they have in prior years because of inflation. So a couple of different moving pieces. One, robust severance tax collections, robust sales tax collections, and also higher inflation. And then also the budget, legislators had and prudently spent federal dollars that have come to the state of Texas in the various COVID relief packages. We're able to implement some of those into the budget. They still have some dollars yet to appropriate, which are not part of this because they haven't appropriated those yet. But the fact is they prudently use those dollars, and that's helped save some of the general revenue expenditures that we would have had this budgeting cycle. So that's really kind of how we got to where we're at, with truly a historical cash carryover balance that we have never seen before in Texas history. And then just lastly, to make a point to drive home, in the last 30 years, if you look at total tax collections, 1 year compared to the prior year, we've had 5 times in those last 3 decades where we have had double-digit increase in 1 year's total tax collections compared to the prior years. And those times have ranged from between 10 to 13%. Last year's fiscal year collections was a record almost 26% increase compared to the year before. So greater than we could have ever anticipated 2 years ago or even 18 months ago. The economy has performed very well in Texas.
Thank you, Controller Hager. We have a number of questions. Again, a lot of numbers coming out in your formal presentation. Thank you for clarifying a little bit and boiling some of that down. Eleanor from the Star Telegram is asking about, I'm going to kind of paraphrase a little bit what she's asking. So one, is she correct in understanding that she writes 188.23 million, but I believe what she means is $188.23 billion is the total that is available for spending. One, does that include the $32.7 billion cash carry balance? And two, you know, what they have available, what the revenues that they have, that is different from what they're limited to under the various spending caps. Could you touch on both of those two issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first and foremost, if you look at the overall total revenue available for general purpose spending, that almost $189 billion, that includes the cash carryover balance that is projected at the end of this current fiscal year of almost $33 billion. So that is part of that number. That is the total amount that they have available of general revenue for spending. Now, that doesn't include federal dollars, dedicated general revenue that's for a specific purpose. So that's essentially what they so-called have discretion over. And of that, they are limited by, secondly, the constitutional spending limit, which is a limitation on how much they can spend from one 2-year budget cycle to the next on tax collections. And then there's second, a statutory provision that they have implemented recently that puts limits on how much they can spend. And that deals with a greater subset of revenues called consolidated revenues. And so one, the constitutional spending limit takes a majority vote to be able to spend above that limit. And then the statutory consolidated fund total is a 3/5 vote. And so therefore the point being is they have up to $189 billion for general purpose spending. However, with that being said, they are limited by the one constitutional and the statutory spending limits. And I'll just add, Texas, we cannot deficit spend. We are not like some other states. We're not like the federal government. And that has proved very well for the state of Texas that we are limited by how much we can spend from one biennium to the next, regardless of how much revenues come in the state treasury.
Thank you, Comptroller Hager. Bob Garrett of the Dallas Morning News asks, you've said the BRE already reflects about $3.8 billion in GR savings carried forward from the use of COVID-related federal funds. Do you have a sense of how much additional money is available on top of what was carried forward for lawmakers to substitute in the coming budget?
Yeah, so as of today, it appears as though by best discussions with other agencies, the LBB, that roughly there's $4 billion left in federal dollars that have come to the state of Texas that are sitting in the Treasury that the legislature has not appropriated, and they can appropriate those dollars, which in essence could free up general revenue, and that $4 billion would then be added on top of the $189 billion for general purpose spending. But then also I must make a comment that there are probably some expenses that the legislature needs to finish in a supplemental appropriation for this current budget, such as Medicaid and a few other dollars that they may want to spend. So you'll have to take both those components into play.
Thank you. That's an important distinction that I think sometimes gets overlooked as we look forward to that 24-25 budget. Remember, there's still a supplemental that the legislature is going to need to tackle. I see Scott Braddock of Quorum Report asking a question here. Comptroller, if I remember correctly, you haven't in the past suggested ways in which lawmakers might, spend money or craft the budget. I know you've had some suggestions in the past. This is a little bit different. We've got a historic balance that you're reporting today. So, you mentioned a few of your priority or the priorities that you have in your mind. Obviously, you're a former legislator. So, can you go into a little bit more detail about what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've tried to do in the term that while I've been in office is talk about not just a 2-year budget cycle, but let's look further out for the state's long-term liabilities. What are the things that we have to deal with as a state, not just in this 2-year budget cycle, but further out, whether in the past that was pension liabilities, deferred maintenance on state buildings, infrastructure funding. What are those things that pay real dividends over the long term? And so I feel like this is really kind of a continuation of those discussions that I've had, and the legislature has taken very good steps on a wide range of issues over past legislative sessions. But this is truly historic. And you mentioned that in your question, that this revenue estimate is absolutely historical when compared to any other estimate that we've given. We have never had a cash carryover balance of $30+ billion. And amazingly, we're also talking about Texas having a mild recession. So you don't have those two go hand in hand when you talk about a possible mild recession and then also such a large cash carryover balance. So I think it's imperative that we talk about not losing sight of what do we need to do. This is the taxpayers' dollars. It is the dollars of the state of Texas. And so of those priorities, in my opinion, is continuing to make sure that we invest in those infrastructure, whether that's our broadband services, connecting people. We know that we have 3 million households, 7 million people do not have high-speed broadband capability in and at their homes, and it's vital for people being able to do their work, for telemedicine, kids being able to have access to education. So I think that's vital. We have a real opportunity. Water infrastructure, road infrastructure, our electric grid, and also making sure that we take care of the basic services that our taxpayers need, which is having good quality people in here in state government, being able to adjust salaries, hopefully, because those that are on the lower income scale are having a really hard time in this historical 40-year inflationary pressures, whether that's our state employees, our teachers, our nurses, and making sure that we have people that have high quality skills that you and I need to do basic things, whether that's plumbing, air condition work, carpentry. So I think we have a real opportunity to take care of not just today, but in future sessions. And then, lastly, as we've seen in the last year, we've had historical rise in property values across the state. And while the state of Texas does not collect property taxes at all, it's against the Constitution, we do not collect it. There is a role with the state and local school districts having funding public education. And if local governments do not keep their rates lower as values rise, then we see our taxes go up. And so therefore, I think it's imperative, as leadership has talked about, being able to take a meaningful step in property tax relief this legislative session.
I think a lot of folks are focused on that issue. I could see in the questions that have been posed here, there's a number of folks asking questions about the sort of mechanics of property tax cuts. And I think that issue, along with several other priority issues, the question I think for lawmakers is going to be navigating those priorities against spending caps. And so we have a couple of folks here, Kimberly of Spectrum News, and then we have another anonymous question asking if property tax cuts count against our spending limits. And I know you've talked a little bit about this with lawmakers already. So can you give us a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, so if you look at the two different spending limits that we have here in the state of Texas, the constitutional, and then which is tax collections, and then secondly, consolidated revenues, which is the statutory provision that the legislature put in session last cycle, and that one exempts tax relief as well as disaster funding. And so there's two different limits, and they take different revenues into account, and they have different thresholds to be able to go above those limits. I've never seen a legislature that's willing to go above those constitutional limits. That's not my vote, that's the legislature's votes, but I think that's one vote that I'm not sure that they would want to take. But what they can do is they can actually take dollars out of general revenue. What I would say, that's our checking account, to make it simplistically. So the state checking account, general revenue, the $189 billion that they have for discretionary purposes, they can take a portion of that and essentially put it in what I deem a state savings account. And that savings account can be allocated for a specific purpose in the future. And so while they don't appropriate those dollars and spend them, which then counts towards the constitutional spending limit as well as the statutory spending limit, if you spend it, it counts towards it. But if you move it over into a savings account that you tell everybody this is the purpose that we're going to use it for in the future, then you can sustain, for example, a property tax relief 2 years, 4 years, 6 years into the future, but you can dedicate, that's what we're going to use it for, or whether that's going to be for infrastructure funding or whatever the legislature may deem. So there is not going against the spending limit, but it's making sure we use those dollars in future years for that purpose. So they can't spend it technically in the next 2 years, but they can make sure that we spend it wisely in the out years and in the future.
Thank you, Controller Hager. We've got a couple of questions here. I know that you have been focused on recently on water issues. You've been focused on broadband connectivity as well. You've been on tours of our ports of entry, both sea and land. So you've talked about the need to invest in port infrastructure. We've got a couple of questions here related to water infrastructure. Ken Kramer is asking about federal funding available for water infrastructure. I know we've talked about that there's about 1.45 billion for new programs in federal funding and about 1.7 billion in existing programs. Ken asks, does that funding need to be committed or obligated during the current biennium? And then we have another question on water asking, what are some of the things as you went out on your tour? What are some of the things that you saw, and what are some of the priorities that you see as to meet Texas's water needs coming in the future?
Yeah, those are great questions. And one of the first and foremost, if we look at the needs of the state of Texas, is to keep in mind that every morning when we wake up, and this is just hard to fathom, and I make this comment in really every speech that I give across the state, every morning when you wake up, there's roughly another 1,000 people to 1,200 people that call Texas home every day. Half of those people are natural growth, and half of those people move to the state of Texas. And so with that unprecedented growth, with the numerous number of business relocations and expansions that have been announced over just the course of the last 18 months, not to mention the last 5-10 years here in the state of Texas, that strain on our current water system is going to be even greater. And I think, when we wake up, we turn on our water and we take it for granted. We expect it to be there. And so what does the state need to do in partnership with those local entities, like we do our municipalities, our river authorities, those providers across the state of Texas? How can we make sure that we have that? And so right now we have dedicated a lot of money towards water infrastructure over the course of the last several sessions and taken very responsible steps to meet those needs. But I think as we see the dollars that are available, is that something that the legislature wants to reevaluate, whether that is appropriating dollars this biennium or setting aside for future bienniums? I think that's something that they will discuss during this legislative session. And lastly, I'll just mention one of the things that we recognize, and I recognize as I was traveling across the state, some regions of the state do a lot better in conservation and using less water than other parts of the state do. And it's not unbeknownst to me that during a drought, we tend to focus more on water than we do at times of plenty, which is why I wanted to talk about it this last year as so much of the state had a drought. But also to keep in mind that when people are using more water, sometimes that's a revenue stream for that local provider of water sources. And so there's not necessarily the incentive to decrease water use. And I think that it is really imperative that we're all a little bit wiser and we use that opportunity to make sure that we're trying to conserve more for the future generations rather than just turning the tap on more often. And some areas of the state do a better job than others. And I think it's imperative that certain parts of the state step up to the plate and do a better job, just like some of the regions have already and across the state. And that doesn't cost any money to be able to do it that way.
And I know water has been an issue for you for a long time, and I know that this is a good time to let folks know that all the information that you're finding here today is available on the Controller's website, comptroller.texas.gov /revenue-estimate. But that only scratches the surface of the resources that we have available through the office and through the Controller Hager's website. The controller just completed a tour of water management infrastructure throughout the state. There's a lot of information on our website on that, as well as a whole host of other economic studies that he has focused on. So comptroller.texas.gov, a lot of resources available for press, the general public, legislators, legislative staff, a whole host of resources. I want to move on to John Moritz. This is a question we've seen a couple of times here. John Moritz of the USA Today Network talks about, given the high rainy day fund balances that we've seen and what we are projecting moving forward, does it make sense to lower the rate of taxation or the amount of money that is flowing into that is paid into the ESF? And I think, as a lot of the folks on this call might not be completely familiar with how what money goes into the rainy day fund, how the split between the rainy day fund and the highway fund mix. And so if you could maybe go into a little bit of background and then, address some of these high balances.
Yeah, just kind of real quick, just to touch on essentially our economic stabilization fund or rainy day fund, our state savings account that was created in 1988 by the voters of the state of Texas, 34 years old now, $13 billion in it as we stand here today. And then in 2 years from now, we expect it to have, under this estimate, around 26 billion plus almost $27 billion in that fund. Now, how that fund gets dollars into it is through oil and gas severance tax collections. And so we have roughly about the first 600 million for simplistic purposes of natural gas collections and oil collections, two different numbers. Just say 600 million for each stay in the general treasury. And then above those numbers, 25% stays in the treasury for education. And then the remaining 75% had always been designated for the Economic Stabilization Fund. But then when that fund started accumulating quite a bit of money in it, thanks to the revival of the Permian Basin, as well as the Eagle Ford Shale and some other shale discoveries here in the state of Texas, and efficiencies in our oil and gas industry to be able to extract those natural resources out of the ground, those funds were accumulating more dollars. The legislature decided, the voters approved a constitutional amendment that as long as the rainy day funds has a certain amount in it, then half of the money is going to go to fund transportation needs, because we have transportation infrastructure needs in the state of Texas. And so as a result, by lowering those, that also doesn't just impact the Economic Stabilization Fund, it would also impact transportation funding, and it would come specifically from oil and gas severance tax collections. That issue in question comes up every so often during legislative session. I have no doubt it will probably be discussed again this legislative session. We are getting to be historical numbers in those funds. One of the things that I point out that I think it is imperative that at some point in time we won't have the same revenues coming up out of the ground from the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford, the Barnett Shale. And so therefore, if it doesn't in another 10, 15, 20, 30 years, whatever that time period is, how do we make sure that we have a state savings account that's there for future generations? So that's one point that I try to make, making sure that we save something for future generations. And so those are really great questions, and I think the legislature will probably ask and talk about all those this coming legislative session.
Thank you, Comptroller. You have sort of is throughout your career as a lawmaker, as controller, have been an advocate for conservative fiscal management. You talked about the uncertainty that you see in the coming years in 24, 25. You talked about the potential for a mild recession. I think along those lines, Brad Johnson of the Texan News asked, Comptroller, is there a sort of sum of money that you think would be fiscally prudent to save or set aside and not spend? And some of that goes to the rainy day fund discussion that we're having right now too.
Yeah, one of the things that I've said is I think that it's prudent and imperative to be able to try to retain somewhere between 7-8% in a state savings account relative to our general purpose spending overall. And that's a target that the legislature's put into place. So at least when we have an economic downturn, because the fact is, as we stand here today, we talk about these economic the revenues that are coming in the Treasury. Some type of large downturn in the national economy in the future that will impact the state of Texas seems so far removed. However, the reality is that will happen one day. So having something set aside for that downturn is important. Having something set aside for natural disasters that unfortunately do happen to impact the state of Texas. It was just over 5 years ago that we had Hurricane Harvey that impacted large swaths of the Texas Gulf Coast. And so therefore being able to have those dollars, I think, are imperative to be able to have them, but also be willing to use them. I don't see a need for the legislature to use part of the Economic Stabilization Fund this cycle. Obviously, that's their decision and the debates that they will have. However, I think it's important to be able to maintain some type of reserve fund, but then also just to throw out some of the ideas that I've talked about earlier today is that I think a constitutional spending limits are extremely important. They have served Texas very well over the years and will continue to. Yet with that being said, being able to take some of these dollars and possibly set it aside to be utilized in the next upcoming years for whether that is infrastructure funding, property tax relief, would be a prudent decision to make. And I think that's something the legislature will be discussing later on this session.
We've talked a little bit about the ESF. Now we talked about setting aside money. You've talked about, what the volatility. I know in your presentation you talked a little bit about the volatility of severance taxes. We do have some folks asking about, where you see oil prices going, what you foresee as your sort of level of certainty with those prices and production levels, and what are some of the sort of unknowns out there that you and your team are taking into account when it comes to that sector of our economy?
Yeah, one of the first and foremost things that I would mention is, thankfully, we don't budget off of severance taxes on a year-to-year basis, and that's extremely important because they are very volatile. And one of the charts that I hand out to the legislature is that if you look up and down sales tax collections, motor vehicle collections, severance tax collections, and on the bottom, there's an average of what it's been over the last 30 years. And for example, severance tax collections in this example have increased single digits over the course of the last couple decades. However, I challenge legislators to look up and down that chart because there's not one year where there's a single digit increase or a single digit decrease. The point is, it's volatile. There's changes into the global economy. No one could have predicted the unfortunate invasion of Ukraine by Russia, what that impacted, not just oil prices, but natural gas prices, which in part has driven some of the historic revenues we've had in severance tax collections because of higher natural gas prices and the need to be able to move natural gas to Europe and other parts of the world. And so therefore, that volatility in the global economy, as China is opening up its economy back and loosening COVID restrictions, which is hard to even imagine that as of just a month and a half ago, they were still under strict COVID restrictions. What is their economy going to do? Is that going to put a greater use and need on oil and drive prices up, or is it going to be a more stagnant recovery for them, which would keep it lower? And so those are questions that we really can't control. And so we do the best that we can in predicting those. And so therefore, as we see it today, oil prices, we have them in the 70s, $80, moving up to roughly $90 in the second year of the biennium. But with that being said, I make one point. If we look at the experts, the people that trade in oil and gas all the time, if we look at the NYMEX futures, December of next year, there's a 95% certainty that it's going to be somewhere between $37 and $175 a barrel. So if I look at the experts and they're 95 certain between $37 and $175, then I think as of right now, our estimates in the revenue estimate are pretty good.
Notoriously volatile is an understatement. I have a question here. We've got a couple questions for a little bit more detail on inflation. There's some folks who are asking, how much roughly is inflation, how much of the growth we've seen in sales tax is attributable to inflation. Some folks are asking what we see inflation's impact being kind of as we look out into the 24-25 fiscal years. Some folks asking whether we think that the Fed's action is actually going to get inflation under control, and how much we see interest rate increases impacting our revenue estimate. So maybe in order to kind of catch all some of that stuff, if you could kind of give us a little bit of a download of what you've seen on inflation and what you are seeing in the future on inflation.
So let's just first start here. Pre-pandemic, 20-year history, roughly a little over 2% inflation. However, as of the last quarter, the last 3 months, we've seen roughly somewhere around 13-15% almost of sales tax receipts are due to inflation. And so therefore much higher inflation than we've had in the last year, the last 18 months than we've ever had before. And so that's the reason I mentioned earlier, both in a question earlier as well as kind of alluding to and talking about in the layout of the revenue estimate, that if you look at sales tax receipts, again, the major workhorse of tax collections for the state of Texas, and roughly 59% of all the tax collections that we have is in the sales tax range. And so looking at just that area, we as consumers have roughly spent about $4.5 billion more a month in just taxable items. That doesn't include non-taxable items such as groceries as well as medication. So just in that area, roughly $4.5 billion that we've spent more a month, which translates then to roughly over $800 million a month that we've been receiving in the last couple of months just due to inflation. And so therefore, when you talk about $3.9 billion in a single month, which is what we've collected in the last 2 months, both historical numbers, but then also realize that 800 million of that, roughly a little more than, has been due to inflationary pressures. That's a significant number. And that's also a significant number that's coming out of the pockets of average citizens, and especially those that are on the lower income scale who can't afford that increase and have to make really tough choices in their own personal household. So the answer to the question of whether the Fed, obviously, I think the Fed is committed to bringing inflation down. Personally, we think that that's going to take a little bit longer time to bring down. It's not something that's going to happen in the next quarter. Obviously, how that's going to impact the economy is still a question mark and a debate among many economists and many smart people. As those rates have been rising, that prices a certain number of people out of entering into buying a home, that prices out certain projects of being able to be constructed because that higher loan cost is there. So that will undoubtedly, as the Fed continues to raise rates, if they do, that's going to impact some industries such as the construction industry, the home development industry, may impact, and as we've already seen in some areas, of being able to purchase a car. So those items that require more dollars and being able to have a loan, it will have a downward pressure in some of those areas, in some of those industry sectors.
Thank you, Comptroller. This will be a quick one. We've had a couple of folks ask about what the delta is between the expenditures that we've seen in 2022-23 and the final projected revenues for 2022-23. That is your $32.7 billion surplus. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. Essentially, we've had very robust sales tax collections, severance tax collections, as I mentioned, also that inflationary pressures, and those have helped drive that $32.5 billion, almost $33 billion cash carryover balance that's projected at the end of August into September 1. But a component of that is also, as I mentioned, the legislature in the last year has utilized some of the federal dollars, which I think is very wisely, to be able to serve general revenue for future potential use, and some other cost savings the legislature did not have that they thought they were going to have 2 years ago. So mostly the economy, a piece is inflation, but also a piece of it is federal dollars that they have utilized, as well as some expenses they thought they would have had 2 years ago that they did not. And so all of those pieces have added up to coming out to the $32.7 billion cash carryover balance.
Thank you for clarifying that. We had a couple of questions on what exactly where that was coming from, so I appreciate that. Sergio Martinez Beltran from NPR's Texas Newsroom asked a question. We've kind of got a version of this question, not always focused on the surplus, but also on the 32, but also on the 188 billion. And I'm going to kind of tee this up a little bit by sort of borrowing a line that you use a lot of the time, which is it's complex and it's complicated, and it's not as simple as maybe just an easy number would have you believe. And there are some strategies to kind of move around this, but he asked, how much of the surplus can the state spend before busting the spending cap? And I think we've had other folks ask, how much 188 billion can they spend before busting the spending cap? And it's complex and it's complicated, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wish when I first ran for this office, it would have said on the form that I had to fill out with the Secretary of State's office and file that this is a complex and complicated job, not just revenue estimating, but almost everything we do here is complex and complicated. And so while I've asked my staff to help us figure out the question that you've just asked, some of those numbers, the Legislative Budget Board estimates those. It will change. Some of those will change now that we provided them our revenue estimate. And so some of those things we can calculate, some of the things we depend on them to calculate. And so we provide our best guesses, in other words. But I think if you look at everything in total, Part of the question is going to be, is there an unencumbered balance transfer, which is dollars, tax dollars that are not encumbered, that they did not spend at the end of this current two-year budget cycle that ends in August of this year. And in this estimate, we expect that would be a transfer to the rainy day fund of half of that, as required by the Constitution, of $5.7 billion. Now, I expect the legislature might do some things to be able to decide how do they provide property tax relief, funding of infrastructure investments, and are they able to make that number go down? And if they can, well, then that changes a whole subset of numbers. And so it's like a domino effect. Domino goes one way, turn left, turn right. But I think the real bottom line is the revenue estimate that they are provided today, the cash carryover balance included in all revenues as projected under the estimate for the next two-year budget cycle of almost $189 billion under both spending limits, they cannot appropriate all those dollars and spend all those dollars. So therefore, some of those dollars will either be left in the Treasury and or they will utilize another mechanism to be able to spend those dollars in future years on other infrastructure and or property tax relief or whatever they deem. But as of today, they cannot appropriate those dollars without going above those spending limits. And while I'm not going to guess what the legislature is going to do, these are their decisions. However, I would not place a bet that they would bust the constitutional or the statutory spending limit.
Thank you, Controllers. Sort of along those lines, we've got James LeBaugh, who asked, given the temporary nature of this surplus and the potential inability of the legislature to spend it all, is there any interest, are you seeing any interest in investing some of that surplus in a sovereign wealth fund or a legacy fund or a permanent school fund? I know we've talked a little bit about the property tax relief fund as well. What are you seeing as some of the strategies that might be available and some of the sort of novel ideas out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, LeBaugh, and I think you've been around during more leaner times, so it's completely different than what you had to deal with as a revenue estimator. But the fact is, if you look at, I think those ideas and those discussions are just starting. So now we're just providing the revenue estimate. Now the legislature kind of gets a glimpse of, wow, Glenn's been alluding to for a while and managing expectations that expect a wow on the revenue estimate. And undoubtedly there is one now. And so now those ideas are being formulated of what do we do? And really that's why I say this is a historical budgeting session. But I also know there are a lot of ideas out there, and those ideas can spend this money fivefold over immediately. And that's why, listening to policymakers, the decision makers, leadership, they want to be prudent, they want to be responsible, because they know it's not the state's money, it's the taxpayers' money.
That's a good point, and I think one that you've always considered and that the lawmakers keep at the front of their mind. We've got a couple of questions here about cost of Texas debt service as interest rates are going up. I know you meet every year with the ratings firms, the four big ratings firms to establish Texas's credit rating. So I guess my question to you is, what are some of those long-term obligations that you're paying attention to? I know we don't, carry a lot of state debt in Texas, but we do issue a TRAN from time to time. Interest rates have gone up, so I know that the cost of debt service is a concern. And then sort of overall from those ratings agencies, are you hearing, is Texas a good investment still? Are we maintaining the credit ratings that we have come to enjoy?
Yeah, those are great questions. And if you look at the credit ratings for the state over the course of the years that I've been hearing prior to, we're a AAA state, and we've continued to maintain our AAA status. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned in the legislature, and they've taken, been very responsive each legislative session to take additional steps on some of those long-term issues that have impacted our potential or could impact our credit rating, whether it's water infrastructure, road infrastructure, whether it is our pension system. And they've taken very prudent steps on all of those to help eliminate any threat potentially to our credit rating. Now, that doesn't mean there couldn't be future threats in the future. That's why it's imperative to continue to look longer term rather than short term. But with that being said, Texas has a very positive outlook. We are growing as an economy. We're more affordable than most other states. And so therefore, as a result, we're an attractive state. But that also means people want to move here, and that rises the cost of living over time. So how do we make decisions today that will impact the state in future years to make sure it continues to be a more affordable place that people can make a good living for them and for future generations?
Absolutely, absolutely. Along those lines, well, before we are coming to the end of our time here, so I'll put out a final plea for any last questions that we can get to. We've got a couple in the queue here. I'm going to try to get to them. It's a good time to remind folks, this doesn't bring an end to the event. We're going to try to we're going to put up some contact information here shortly after the Q&A. If you don't get your question answered, please feel free to reach out to us. We have a question from, it was anonymous, but I believe he filled in his name afterwards. It's come from Tim Lee from the Texas Retired Teachers Association, who says he appreciates the examples of how to invest some of the excess extra money that we have. He mentions that retired teachers, and I think this is probably true for a lot of folks living on fixed income, are particularly impacted by inflation. And so he asked, can you see using some of that cash carryover balance to provide Texas's retired teachers a pension increase? I know the legislature has taken some steps on teacher pensions. That kind of dovetails into a lot of long-term liabilities you've discussed. Can you talk a little bit about those more broadly, and maybe the teacher pension more specifically?
Yeah, I think that, that question goes exactly to some of the group of people that I'm talking about that are living on a fixed income or either have a lower income scale capability that can't absorb a 10%, 13% inflationary rate that we've had, and talking about inflation continuing to exist. Will it continue to go up at those levels? No, it will not. It'll continue to subside here but for several years. It'll continue to, at least in the most immediate time period this year, unfortunately not completely abate to go back to historical levels of just over 2%. So with that being said, I have no doubt the legislature will look at all of the different areas, and obviously they've taken steps on teacher retirement, health care for retired teachers, but a cost of living adjustment, not just either one time or over time, is something that has been discussed for a couple of sessions now, and undoubtedly retired teachers will be talked about quite a bit in the building again this session, I think.
Thank you, sir. Final question. I think, you've talked about the recession. You've talked about Texas's recession being shorter and shallower than other places. You've got a singular sort of view into the Texas economy. You're waking up tomorrow morning. Where you want to be?
Well, I want to be right here in Texas. The fact is there's no better place to be in Texas. And I don't know, I haven't been able to be outside much today, but I hear and I can see out my window. It's a great place to be out on a day like today. So I want to be here in Texas and nowhere else.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate your making the time to answer a lot of the questions. I know we didn't get to everything, but we are just running out of time right now. So I know there's a couple of questions that have not been answered yet. I think we can bring an end to our Q&A discussion with Comptroller Hager. We're going to put up a screen right now with some contact information that I want to give folks an opportunity to jot down. If we did not get to your question today, please send us an email. We are happy to run down any numbers that didn't come across clearly on this, provide those to you. We can, I like to say that I get paid to pretend like I know what I'm talking about, but there's a lot of folks in this building who actually know what they're talking about. And so we are happy to engage those folks and make sure we get some detail on anything that we weren't able to get to today. I also want to remind folks the controller's formal presentation at the beginning of this will be available in immediately after this via our social media channels. If you don't follow at TX Comptroller, please give us a follow. There's a lot of additional detail, a lot of information there. And the replay of the formal part of this video will be available on that site immediately following this event. Additionally, we will have the full recording with the question and answer period available at the end of the day today. We need a little bit of time to clean up some of my uhs and ums and things like that. But that's going to be available at comptroller.texas.gov/revenue-estimate. Again, that's comptroller.texas.gov/revenue-estimate. That's going to have this presentation at the end of the day. It's already got links to the BRE itself, as well as the infographics used in today's presentation and some additional detail and resources. I know there are a lot of folks out there looking to dig into this a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So all that information is up there and available right now. Again, we're going to put the recording on social media immediately. We're going to put the full recording with the Q&A up here at the end of the day today. And I want to thank not only Controller Hager, but all the controller staff who contributed to this event today. The revenue estimating team, as the controller mentioned, has been working on this estimate for a long time, continued to work on it right up until the last minute here. And it has done a fantastic job on a really heavy lift leading into this session. I want to thank the controllers media team and web teams for all the work they have done to make this possible. And I want to wish the members of the 88th Legislature good luck as session kicks off tomorrow. Remember, we are here to assist as you work through the next 140 days. Thank you again for attending today. And this concludes the January 2023 Biennial Revenue Estimate.